A couple weeks ago, something kinda crazy happened, but it requires a little context to understand. In May of 2026, Wizards of the Coast started doing what they call drops on D&D Beyond. The idea here is pretty simple. Every month there will be a content drop that has some new stuff for the game, such as feats, spells, magic items, and monsters. In order to access any of this content, you do need to have a D&D Beyond Hero Tier subscription, so this stuff isn't free, but it's more or less bonus content if you're a paid member of the site. It's also worth noting that this content is official and published by Wizards of the Coast, however, none of it is legal in Adventurers League. But that doesn't really matter when it comes to today's topic, because we're not here to talk about player options or anything related to the discourse happening around D&D Beyond Drops right now. We are here to talk about some monsters. In the July content drop, WotC published 4 official updates to the suite of para-elementals from 3rd edition. The Ice, Magma, Mud, and Smoke elemental all got new artwork and some 5e stats. These elementals are all basically just different combinations of the 4 primary D&D elementals. Smoke is an elemental of fire and air, Mud elementals are made from water and earth, etc. And as regular viewers of this channel will know, on the 17th of June, exactly 2 weeks before the July D&D drop went live, I uploaded a video about para-elementals, complete with my own 5th edition stat block update. So here we have an established creature from D&D's past, with established lore and established themes, being updated into the latest version of the game. Both the WotC designer, or designers, and myself were working with the exact same information, and because these stat blocks came out so close together, there's no chance that whoever designed the official stat blocks could have been influenced by my conversion, and obviously I hadn't seen the official stat blocks before they were released. So I thought this would be a really cool and unique opportunity to take a look at these stat blocks and see how they compare. Not just so that I can look at how my own designs stack up to something official, which is of course something I'm curious to know, but also so we can take a look at what kind of choices go into creating a monster for D&D, why you might choose one thing over another, and discuss the actual game design side of things, which is not something I usually have time to do in my typical monster videos. So today we're gonna dive into the world of creature design right after a big ol' shout out to the sponsor making it all happen, Hex's Hue. Hex's Hue is an independently made animated webcomic about magic. Well, specifically, it's about a mage named Hai whose attempt at using magic to expedite the watering of their plants causes an arcane catastrophe that siphons all the colors from their body and anything they touch henceforth. You know, classic sorcerer shenanigans. The other main character is one of my favorite archetypes in fantasy, the one which I refer to as a muscle wizard, that is a wizard who mostly relies on brute strength and being swole to solve her problems. So the two of them need to work together to find a fix, and of course there are mysteries and possibly sinister forces at work. The first episode is up on YouTube if you want to check it out, and the folks behind this project are also running a Kickstarter to make it a complete series with human-made art, voice acting, music, the whole deal. So if you want to support some cool indie animation and check out Hex's Hue for yourself, the link to both the first episode and their Kickstarter page are in the description down below. Thank you so much to Hex's Hue for bringing us here this week to talk about cool fantasy monsters. Speaking of which, let's peep them creatures. The design philosophy behind creating any monster I subscribe to is pretty simple. You want it to be evocative, you want it to create an opportunity for cool moments at the table, and you want it to present a challenge. Presenting a challenge doesn't always mean that the monster is super deadly or that it has a ton of insane abilities. Sometimes that challenge is simply just the threat it poses to the adventuring party's hit points. But it can also be things like denying their resources, taxing their resources, or forcing them to think outside the box to overcome whatever the abilities this creature has might be. Another really important thing to consider when designing a monster is what the monster's function is within its most likely encounter set. I like to think of this almost as the DM equivalent to creating an adventuring party. Often you'll hear players say things like, oh, we have a fighter and a sorcerer, so maybe I'll play a cleric so that way we've got some reliable healing to round things out. As a DM, it can be really useful to think about the different roles monsters are likely to play in an encounter, and that thought process starts with the creature's core design. For example, example, a simple skeleton is unlikely to be a big threat on its own, and typically its role is to be one of many fighting in a big group or to act as a minion for a more powerful creature, so the humble skeleton doesn't really need a bunch of pomp and circumstance surrounding it. Whereas something like a lich or vampire is going to be front and center in most encounters. If you're fighting a lich and the lich isn't the most important bad guy in the room, something crazy is going on in your campaign, which isn't an indictment, but it is something important to recognize because as a creature likely to be in that boss monster role, the lich needs to have a bunch of crazy powers and legendary actions it can perform. As for elementals, para-elementals included, they fall into a bit of a weird zone in terms of role because they can kind of be both. And by elementals here, I mean like the core group of elementals and now the 4 para-elementals we have. A single fire elemental can be a huge threat for a low-level group of adventurers, but it can also be a creature summoned by an adventuring party. And as an adversary, you're likely to be fighting a couple of them at a time once you get into higher tiers of play. So they need to be powerful, but not too powerful, which is why the 4 primary elementals have a challenge rating of CR 5. It puts them right in the sweet spot. Now, before we get into the actual comparisons, I do just want to say that my goal here is not to dunk on WotC or any of their designers' work. I genuinely think that this is just a cool opportunity to do some game design dissection and talk about the state of the game as far as creature design is concerned. So with that said, we're gonna kick things off by taking a look at the Ice Elemental. So immediately looking at this, there are some pretty striking similarities. In the 3rd edition printing of all these monsters, they are each presented with 6 different versions spanning all challenge ratings, so when making a 5e version of this creature, assuming we are limiting ourselves to 1 stat block, you could really choose just about any challenge rating for your monster. However, both the official version and mine have them pegged at a CR of 6. My reason for doing so was because all the basic elementals in 5e are CR5 monsters, so I figured that the para-elementals all being CR6 made sense since they're a little bit more powerful and it gives you some more juice while still keeping them in that flexible spot for multiple tiers of play. There's also a lot of crossover here when looking at the list of immunities and resistances. This stuff is all pretty obvious for the most part, however, the 2 big differences are that my Ice Elemental is only resistant to piercing and slashing damage, whereas the WotC Ice Elemental is also resistant to bludgeoning. I chose not to give my elemental bludgeoning resistance because I like the idea that smashing this thing with a hammer is more effective than trying to pierce it or slash it with a sword, and I stand by that. However, the other big difference here is that my elemental is vulnerable to fire damage, whereas theirs is not. Rather than give the creature vulnerability, they gave their elemental a trait called aversion to fire, which is actually pretty cool. No pun intended. The way this works is that if the elemental takes fire damage, its piercing form trait doesn't function on its next turn, and it has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks until the end of next turn. I actually really like this as it replaces a static vulnerability to a type of damage with something reactionary that the players can engage with. It's a lot more interesting to have a damage type mess with the creature's abilities and attacks than it is to simply make the damage number bigger, and then you don't have to give the creature more defenses to compensate for having such a common weakness. This is also part of the reason why my Ice Elemental has a higher AC and 17 more hit points, because fire vulnerability is brutal. Looking at the stats of these 2 creatures, they are also remarkably similar. The Elemental's strength, constitution, and wisdom are literally identical, though it seems the WotC Ice Elemental gained 2 points of intelligence but lost 1 point of charisma. Overall, a very similar stat array except for the creature's dexterity. The official Ice Elemental has a dex of 10, whereas dex is my Ice Elemental's primary stat, sitting at 20. And this actually raises my first point of criticism. The reason I made their primary attack stat dex over strength is because, well, look at this guy. Not only in the 3rd edition art, but also in the art I had made for the video and the WotC commission for their new creature, this is not screaming brute strength to me. The 3rd edition art is actually a little bulkier, so I could see it, but when I look at any of this artwork, I am picturing slashing claws and fast movements. I mean, it's a magical creature, so it could be as strong as you say it is, but visually, this reads to me as a dexterous boy. If I was playing D&D and my DM showed me this artwork, I would be expecting a highly dexterous creature. The designer also probably didn't have a say over the art brief that was sent to the artist, but it just feels like an oversight, because you could totally depict an Ice Elemental that is bulkier and not as fast with a hulking, strong form pretty easily, so I have to imagine this was just something that wasn't considered. This is also why I gave my Ice Elemental a move speed of 40, 10 feet over the standard baseline of 30 feet, which the WotC Elemental also has. They did think to give their Ice Elemental a swim speed though, which honestly makes sense given they are half water elemental, so in retrospect, I probably would have added that to my conversion as well, but onto the creature's traits. The official elemental has a trait called Piercing Form that deals 1d10 damage to anything within 5 feet of it once per turn, unless it's taken fire damage and the spikes have been melted. I too gave my elemental an aura effect called Frost Aura, however mine is a bit more punishing. Not only does it reach out twice as far, but it also does 2d6 cold damage, with the idea here being that the creature is so cold that it emits this frosty chill in all directions. Also, if you're wearing metal armor within the emanation, you have disadvantage on attack rolls and saving throws, which is a callback to the chill metal ability of the 3rd edition elemental. Analyzing this now, it might be a little bit too punishing for martial characters, but I also think it's really thematic and kinda awesome. To me, stuff like this creates moments at the table. Maybe the barbarian is able to make a snarky comment towards the fighter because he doesn't need to wear armor in combat, whereas the fighter who relies on plate mail to have a good armor class is now having some trouble dealing with this creature. This is something that challenges the DM too, because you do need to be a little bit thoughtful here. You don't want to be constantly putting the party up against monsters that screw over one specific character every single time, but giving them challenges that let different characters shine in different ways is always nice. Secondly, I do think this creature is an opportunity for the DM to let their players strategize a little bit. If you know they're going to be fighting a bunch of ice elementals in the adventure you're running, give them an encounter with one of these things early on so they know what they're up against. Maybe the fighter, after dealing with an ice elemental for the first time, decides to go into town and change up their gear a little bit to be better equipped to deal with an ice elemental next go around, maybe swapping out that metal armor for something that's not going to give them so many penalties. I also gave my elemental a trait called Ice Glide that is basically Earth Glide, except it allows them to move through ice and snow instead of dirt and rock, and my version of the aversion to fire trait is called Melt. Melt makes it so that whenever the elemental takes 20 or more fire damage, its speed increases by 10 feet until the end of next turn as it slides around. This is ostensibly a good thing for the elemental, as it lets the creature speed up. However, it does interact with the reaction I gave them called Flash Freeze. Flash Freeze, in my opinion, is a very fun ability. The way this works is that when a creature hits the ice elemental in melee, they have to make a saving throw. If they fail that save, they are pulled into the elemental space and frozen to their body. While frozen, the target is restrained and they move with the elemental. The creature or one of their allies can try to pull someone off the elemental, of course, and if the elemental takes 20 fire damage, all creatures and objects frozen to them are no longer frozen. So this isn't at all the same as the WotC Elemental's aversion to fire, however it does kind of the same thing in that it incentivizes you to use fire to deactivate the monster's abilities. The big difference is basically what those abilities do. In terms of actions, both elementals get 2 attacks, however the WotC Elemental does 2d6 plus 4 slashing and 2d6 cold damage, whereas my elemental does 3d6 plus 5 piercing and 2d6 cold damage. And my elemental's attack can also be a ranged attack, not just melee. Pretty comparable, but my elemental is a little bit more deadly. Most elementals also get a big recharge attack, and that is true for both of these stat blocks. The WotC Elemental has Shard Spray, which is a dexterity saving throw and does 2d10 piercing plus 3d6 cold and a 60-foot cone, and anyone caught in the blast has their move speed reduced by 10 for a round. And in a shockingly similar turn of events, my elemental's Blizzard requires a strength saving throw, but does 4d12 plus 5 cold damage, and everything in a 15-foot emanation also has their speed reduced by 15 feet. And for good measure, I added in a degree of failure here, where if you fail by 5 or more, you also get knocked prone. Blizzard does an average of 31 total damage in a 15-foot emanation. Shard Spray does a combined total average damage of 21 in a 60-foot cone. Again, pretty comparable. My elemental's attack just does more damage in a tighter area. Looking at the final piece of the creature's entry, the Ice Elemental Compositions table, we actually managed to have 2 D6 tables that contain 6 completely different bodily features for an Ice Elemental. So that's kind of funny. Overall, I think the WotC stat block is perfectly competent and does something really neat with the aversion to fire trait. However, if I had to choose one, I would be lying if I said I think that this would be more fun to run than the Ice Elemental I created. I will say though, reading through this makes me feel like my Ice Elemental might be a smidge overtuned in terms of how much damage it's putting out and how much it challenges the party's resources, but then again, most of my monsters tend towards the stronger side because 5th edition D&D, especially the 2014 rules, feels very kid gloves for my taste. Personally, I think having monsters that can do more stuff and aren't afraid to swing big creates more dynamic and exciting encounters, but your mileage may vary. I could also see myself using the WotC ice elementals as more of a common elemental and then using my ice elemental as a variant of some kind, like when you're in a World of Warcraft dungeon and you see a kobold run up with a mana bar. But let me know what you guys think, which version you prefer, and why. But moving right along here to our next elemental, we've got the Magma elemental. Once again, my elemental has a higher AC and more hit points, a lot more this time around with a difference of 45. Unlike the ice elemental, the stat line is all over the place here with literally no two stats lining up. Even the modifiers are entirely different this go around, and what I'm seeing here is that they didn't give most of these creatures a 20 in anything, and I gave my Magma elemental a 20 in both strength and con, and they gave theirs an 18 and 16 respectively, which is why mine has so many more hit points. The WotC elemental also has a dex of 14, which seems crazy to me when they gave the ice elemental a dex of 10, but I guess a bulky ass dude made of fire and rock is faster than a spiky frozen man, so whatever. They did give their elemental a burrow speed, which is something I had considered doing, but ultimately decided against because I gave my boy Earth Glide. However, I did specify that when my elemental uses Earth Glide to move through non-magical unworked earth, it converts that material to magma, basically leaving a lava tube in its wake, and if it happens to be moving through sand, it leaves a tube of glass. They gave their magma elemental Earth Passage, which is similar to Earth Glide, except it leaves behind a 5-foot diameter tunnel. I can honestly see the logic for either of these things to be true. On the one hand, you have a dude made of lava superheating the earth and leaving behind a trail of lava, which likely cools pretty rapidly into stone again. On the other, you have a guy moving through the earth, superheating the edges of the earth he moves through to create a tunnel of molten rock that has rapidly cooled into a passage. I don't really think there's a right or wrong way to handle this, and I feel like it's up to the DM to decide what is more useful for the game that they are running. So if you want some cool tunnels to travel through, having a guy whose whole deal is making tunnels is great. If you don't want that, or you for some reason need to have these weird glass structures under the sand or something, having a bunch of guys who do that, also great. They did not give their elemental the illumination trait, which is something that fire elementals have, and that feels like kind of an oversight to me. A fire elemental casts light in a 60-foot area, so I gave the magma elemental a trait which casts light for 30 feet since I figured it would be a bit dimmer, but not having it there at all is just kind of odd. Both creatures do have an aura effect in the way of heat aura on the WotC stat block and the burning aura on my stat block. Heat aura is exactly the same as the WotC ice elemental aura, except it does fire damage, and burning aura is pretty similar to my ice elemental's frost aura, except it does 1d10 fire damage, and instead of affecting creatures in metal armor, it makes all creatures and flammable objects in the area start burning. Burning basically just means you take a d4 fire damage every turn until you take an action to put out the flames, which felt very thematic to me. It's so interesting to see how these two traits are doing more or less the same thing, but one of them feels so much more narratively interesting in my opinion. Again, totally biased, but the difference between taking 2d6 fire damage and taking 1d10 fire damage, but also being on fire, isn't mathematically that big, but narratively, it's everything. The Magma elemental from WotC has the aversion to cold trait that triggers when it takes cold damage and reduces the creature's speed by 10 feet and disables its heat aura for a round, which I do continue to believe is pretty cool and much more interesting than just having a weakness to cold damage. I also avoided giving my elemental a weakness to cold damage though by giving it the rapid cooling trait. This trait is a lot more involved and I think it's pretty evocative. I wanted to do something based on the idea of magma rapidly cooling into obsidian, you know, like in Minecraft. So when my magma elemental takes cold damage, it actually gains 10 temporary hit points, and its speed decreases by 10 feet until its next turn. And if it takes damage while it has temporary hit points, the obsidian on its body shatters, causing 2d10 piercing damage to everything around it. That might strictly seem just like a benefit for the elemental. However, this can also be used against the creature. Sure, you might be giving it some temp HP, but if you nail this thing with some cold damage while it is in the center of a bunch of enemies, you can then hit it again to shatter the obsidian and hurt everything around it, but in a way that is to your advantage. If I were to go back and redesign anything here, I would probably just add text that disables the burning aura for a round, because I do really like the idea of providing some other benefit to using cold damage on this thing, and him just getting cooled off for a minute or so is great. Moving on to actions, the WotC elemental has a burning slam that does 2d6 plus 5 bludgeoning and 2d6 fire. I've been staring at the stat block for like 10 full minutes trying to figure out why it does 2d6 plus 5 damage when it has the strength modifier of plus 4, and I don't know. I genuinely think this is just a mistake and that it should be doing 1 less damage, but if you know something I don't, please tell me. My Magma Elemental has a Molten Slam, which does 2d8 plus 5 bludgeoning and 4d4 fire damage, and the target starts burning. So again, we see my stat block being a bit more punishing here, which I stand by. I also gave my Magma Elemental a rock launch attack that deals less damage but might knock the target prone and can be done from a range. As for the big recharge move, the WotC Elemental has Roiling Lava, which does 4d8 fire damage and a 20-foot radius sphere centered on a point it can see within 120 feet. Hilariously, my Magma Elemental has an ability called Eruption that does 2d12 bludgeoning plus 2d12 fire and a 5-foot radius sphere centered on a point within 90 feet. So overall, mine does more damage in a smaller area, which feels like a balanced trade-off. However, my elemental also transforms the affected area into difficult terrain that burns you, and if you're standing within 10 feet of the elemental when it uses this ability, you get deafened for a round because volcanic eruptions are loud as f***. And once again, the bodily features table has basically no crossover, so we're 2 for 2 on that front. Overall, my feelings here are pretty much the same as with the Ice Elemental. I don't think this is a bad stat block by any means, however, I do think it doesn't do a whole lot to promote interesting interaction and dynamic moments in combat, but the aversion to cold thing is pretty cool. Now moving on to the para-elemental of Earth and Water, we have the OOZE Elemental. This is actually really interesting to me because the WotC designers did something I had debated doing, but ultimately decided against. Historically, the para-elemental plane of Earth and Water has been the plane of OOZE, but sometimes it is referred to as the plane of Mud. The OG para-elemental is an OOZE elemental that does acid damage and acidic things. However, the new official WotC elemental is not an OOZE elemental, but a Mud elemental. It completely detaches itself from the acidic themes of the OOZE plane and just sort of makes a mud guy who does mud guy things. As someone who always found the connection with acidic stuff and OOZE on the para-elemental plane of Mud strange, I had considered doing the exact same thing. But I decided against it because a big part of my channel's focus isn't just on making monsters, but also trying to preserve some of their history and truly breathing new life into them, so I chose to keep my conversion as an OOZE elemental. But despite this, the two creatures ended up sharing way more DNA than you'd think. So to start off, once again, my stat block has a higher AC and 51 more hit points this time around. The resistances and immunities are also a bit different, mostly because my elemental is an acidic creature and theirs is very much not. Their elemental has the aversion to cold and fire trait that forces its speed to become 0 if it takes either damage type, and it can't use its engulf bonus action. However, if it has a creature grappled, that creature has disadvantage to try and escape while this is happening, presumably because the mud has hardened, which I think is very thematic and cool. They gave their creature Mud form, which allows it to move through a space as narrow as 1 foot. I gave mine OOZE form, which is the same except it allows it to move through a space as narrow as 1 inch. And this is where things get a little crazy. The Mud elemental has a sticky slam that does some bludgeoning damage and a jet attack that does some bludgeoning damage from 60 feet away, and it knocks you prone. My OOZE elemental has an acidic slam attack that deals bludgeoning damage and acid damage and corrodes your gear using the same rules as the gray slime. I also gave my OOZE elemental the corrosive body trait, meaning it messes up your weapons if you hit it using the same rules as many OOZEs have. The WotC elemental has a bonus action engulf ability as well that allows it to grapple a creature within 10 feet of it if they are medium or smaller and restrain them. The grappled creature takes damage at the start of every turn while this happens, and when the creature moves, the grappled creature moves with them. My elemental also has engulf, however this action works the same way as the gelatinous cube, meaning that it can move up to half its speed, so 15 feet on land or 30 feet in water, and attempt to engulf anyone in its path during said movement. All engulfed creatures are restrained and suffocating, and they take acid damage each round. Now taking it a step back to compare these two creatures is tough, because we weren't really doing the same thing here, though I do find it hilarious that the one para-elemental I chose not to give a ranged attack to was the one that they did give a ranged attack to. They also skipped on giving this guy Tremor Sense, which I found a little odd, but overall, the Mud elemental is actually my favorite of the WotC elementals we're talking about today. I don't think I can pick between them because they are thematically pretty different. However, I could see both of these creatures existing in the same campaign or even the same encounter. The WotC Mud elemental would work well as a sort of bog standard mud guy, and then you have the OOZE elemental to be a creature from the para-elemental plane of Mud who's maybe formed from some more acrid swamp or something. On the elemental compositions table, we do have one similar result here. Bits of rotting foliage and clumps of wilting plant matter are more or less the same thing, but that was it. Now on to the absolute bastard that is the Smoke Elemental. For the first time since we started this video, we have 2 stat blocks with the same armor class. However, once again, my creature has more hit points with a whopping additional 41 HP. Mine is also a touch slower with a speed of 15 feet and a fly speed of 80 compared to the WotC Elemental's 20-foot speed and fly speed of 90. The stats here are once again very comparable, with the most notable difference being that I gave my elemental more constitution, while they put their elemental's dex at 20 compared to my elemental's dex of 19. Again, I find it really funny that the one para elemental I didn't give a +5 to in their primary attack stat is the one which they did. But let's continue. The resistances and whatnot are all very comparable here, with a notable difference being my elemental is resistant to lightning and immune to acid. The lightning comes from their air elemental heritage, and the acid comes from this idea I had while making this creature that a smoke elemental wasn't just a fire tornado, but could also be sort of this smog entity as well. Both elementals have smoke form, which is literally an identical trait in terms of how it is worded, and of course the WotC elemental has its aversion trait listed as aversion to wind. I gotta be so honest, this one I find a bit odd. Aversion to wind states that if the elemental starts its turn within a strong wind, such as one created by the Gust of Wind spell, it makes a DC 10 Constitution saving throw. On a failed save, the elemental has the incapacitated condition until the end of its next turn. Seeing as this creature is made of wind and fire, this is weird to me. I get the idea here that it's a smoke elemental, so aggressive wind is maybe gonna blow it away or suppress it somehow, but I don't know. Typically, if you have a source of fire and it gets blasted with wind, that fire is gonna be popping off. And if you have wind that is blasted with wind, well, you just gotta have more wind. If anything, I maybe would have altered this so that if it's in the area of a strong wind, the fires within start to take over and it becomes more fire elemental than smoke, maybe losing the ability to fly or something, but doing more fire damage. I don't know, there's something there, but this one doesn't quite feel as intuitive and evocative as the other aversion traits do to me. I gave my elemental the polluted aura trait, which isn't really similar to anything on the WotC stat block. This trait deals poison damage to everything around the elemental and causes creatures to start suffocating, so you don't want to hang out in this thing's presence for too long. As for actions, the smoke elemental has a smoky tendril that deals 1d6 plus 5 bludgeoning damage and 1d4 fire damage, and it blinds you until the end of its next turn. The damage here is pretty low for some reason. I feel like we're putting a lot of value on that blinded condition, but I do love the flavor. There's nothing worse than getting smoke in your eyes, and being blinded in 5e does really suck. So this is kind of sick, actually. My smoke elemental has a claw attack that just does a combination of slashing and fire damage. However, had I thought of it at the time, I 100% would have given this thing the ability to blind you with its smoky claws, because that's great. So props to the WotC stat block on that one. The big recharge ability on the WotC stat block is actually a bonus action called Asphyxiate, which forces a con save on one creature in their space, and if the creature fails it, not only do they take some fire damage, but they also gain a level of exhaustion that lasts for a minute. My smoke elemental has a recharge action called Violent Gasp, which is a con save and deals poison damage to each creature in its space, not just one, and poisons anyone who fails their save. While poisoned, you are suffocating and you take fire as well as poison damage at the start of every turn until you pass the save. These abilities are actually super similar. Suffocating causes exhaustion levels and the damage amount is literally the same, so the big difference here is the number of affected creatures and the fact that my elemental's version of this is an action. It's also worth noting that my stat block gives you the poison condition, which does interact with a bunch of things, so it is theoretically easier to get rid of, but it's more punishing if you can't. Now finally, the last difference is that I just straight up gave my smoke elemental innate spellcasting. I felt like I wanted this creature to be able to do more, and there are a bunch of super thematic spells such as Fog, Cloud, Darkness, Fireball, and Cloud Kill. And I was also leaning more into the smog, poisonous fume angle with my conversion, so I gave it spells like Minor Illusion, Confusion, and Phantasmal Killer to help try and push that narrative idea of this creature causing hallucinations and whatnot with its toxic fumes. Also, my version of this creature has Blind Sight, which is mostly true because I wanted it to be able to cast Darkness and then close in for the kill. Overall, I think the WotC Smoke Elemental might be my least favorite of the official para elementals, just because I don't super jive with the aversion to wind trait, and if you take that away, it's not really doing a whole lot else. In the comments beneath this creature, which is a thing on D&D Beyond, you can just leave comments on basically anything that has a page on the website, people were talking about how brutal this monster is. But I don't really see it. Again, it might be because I tend to make monsters that on average have sharper teeth than the typical stuff being published for 5e by Wizards of the Coast, which is a design choice I stand by, and I think having monsters with teeth sharpened to a fine point is good for the game and makes things more interesting. But when I look at the WotC Smoke Elemental, yes, it does blind you for a round without a save, and yes, it has potential to dole out 1 exhaustion level on 1 creature with a DC of 12, which is super low for a CR6 creature, by the way, but I just don't think it's got the juice to finish the job, especially not with only 78 hit points. Honestly, this creature is most dangerous when paired with something that can just beat the devil out of you. It being able to swoop in and just blind a fool and then give someone an exhaustion penalty before the Iron Golem comes in and just starts taking you to church is way more threatening than a pack of these things on their own. So in that instance, I think this would be an extremely challenging creature to contend with, and for a high-level party, could be pretty cool. But as far as a standalone creature goes, I just want it to be doing a little more, which at the end of the day is both my biggest weakness and greatest strength as a designer. I love giving a dungeon master tons of tools to play with to make those epic moments feel epic and to give their players some genuinely incredible challenges to overcome and feel good about. But I'm also self-aware enough to know that I can occasionally push things too far, and I usually end up designing from a place of reining myself in to get the creature in line with the power level I want it to be sitting at. Sometimes, if I think the cool stuff I've given to a monster is just way too cool to give up, I will make 2 stat blocks and end up with a more powerful variant of a monster and then the pared down weaker version, which is honestly great because then you just end up with 2 or 3 options for you to use. But still, I am constantly evaluating and learning things about game design, and I think that's what every GM is ultimately doing when they sit down to run a game for their players. I just happen to be doing it for an audience, and I've been doing it for a long time now. So on that note, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about these monsters, both my para-elementals and the official WotC versions? Which version do you prefer and why? And what changes might you make to either version to make it more suitable for your game table? Should I start making my creatures a little weaker? I mean, realistically, I probably won't change much in terms of power level, but maybe I'll bump the CR up by 1 from where I would normally put it if you guys think my stuff is too brutal. Also, I can't believe I didn't mention this already, but the artwork from the WotC stuff is super sick. I love the comic book style monsters that Atomic Ink did for my stat blocks. I just think it's cool to see these creatures done in the sort of painted official D&D style as well. They're all looking dope. Anywho, that's all I got for you this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Until then.